All right, let me start this the way it actually felt, slow at first, almost unnoticeable, like the air pressure changing before a storm you don't realize is coming yet. I've lived on the same street for a little over 10 years. Not the flashy kind of neighborhood, not gated, not manicured within an inch of its life. Just a normal, quiet place where people waved when they drove by and occasionally argued about whose turn it was to host the potluck. We didn't have an HOA. Never had. Never wanted one. And honestly, that was part of the charm. If something needed fixing, someone fixed it. If someone wanted to organize an event, they just did. No permission slips, no fines, no laminated rule books telling you what color your fence was allowed to be. And then one summer, a new couple moved in. I'll call them Diane and Marcus. They showed up with a brand new SUV, matching outfits, and that overly polished friendliness that immediately made you feel like you were being evaluated. At first, they seemed eager, asking questions, walking the block, introducing themselves. Diane especially loved talking. She'd stop people mid-walk and ask things like how long they'd lived here, who usually organized neighborhood events, and whether there were standards people followed. That last word should have been my first red flag. Within a couple of weeks, the comments started creeping in. Subtle at first. Oh, that fence color is interesting. Is that many flowers allowed? I thought most neighborhoods preferred uniform lawns. Still, nobody pushed back. New people say dumb things sometimes. You shrug it off. Then the tone shifted. The comments stopped sounding like opinions and started sounding like corrections. Diane began walking the street with a clipboard in the mornings, stopping in front of houses, taking notes, snapping photos with her phone like she was documenting a crime scene. And then the letters appeared. Plain envelopes. No posti. No return address. Just slipped under doors or tucked into mailboxes. Inside was a single page with a bold letterhead that read, Ridgewood Residential Association. None of us had ever heard that name before. The letters listed violations. Fence colors, lawn ratios, decorative items, parking habits, and at the bottom of each notice was a fine. $200, sometimes more, with a deadline, and a warning about late fees and further action. I assumed everyone would laugh it off. They didn't. I found out the truth by accident. I ran into my neighbor, Sarah, one evening while she was getting her mail. She looked tense, distracted. I asked her if she was okay, and she hesitated before saying, I just hope this HOA thing settles down soon. I laughed. What HOA? She stared at me. The Ridgewood Association. My smile faded. I told her we didn't have an HOA. Never had. She shook her head and said Diane showed her documentation. Bylaws. Rules. A registration number. She said if Sarah didn't pay, the fines would escalate, then go to collections, then possibly turn into a lien on her home. And Sarah had paid. That was the moment something cold settled in my gut. Over the next few days, I started asking around. Quietly, carefully, and the pattern became clear. Multiple neighbors had received fines. Several had already paid. Most were scared, not because the rules made sense, but because the consequences sounded terrifying. Nobody wanted to risk their home over a technicality. A few days later, Diane showed up at my house. I was unloading groceries when I heard heels on concrete, fast and deliberate. She didn't greet me. She didn't smile. She just held out a paper like she was serving a warrant. You're in violation of Section 6, Article C, she said. I skimmed the page. Apparently, I was fined for parking in my own driveway. I laughed, not mockingly, genuinely confused. This is my property. She crossed her arms. It's considered shared access. No, I said, pointing to the ground. It's not. It's on my deed. Her expression hardened instantly. The friendliness vanished. You should be careful, she said. Non-compliance has consequences. I told her she might want to double-check the land records. That suggestion did not land well. A few days later, Marcus caught me while I was checking my mail. He took a different approach. Calm, measured, almost friendly. We're a legally established association, he said. Cool, I replied. When did the homeowners vote on it? He paused for just a second too long. That's not something you need to worry about. It is if you're collecting money, I said. That's when his tone changed. He leaned in slightly and said, You're creating instability. Maybe we should start documenting your behavior. Documenting. Such a clean, official word. Designed to sound serious. Designed to scare. That same evening, I found another notice on my driveway. Same violation. Higher fine. And that was it. Fear works on a lot of people. Curiosity works on me. I started researching state registries, county records, municipal offices. I searched the registration number printed on the notices. Nothing. I called the city. No record of any HOA. No findings. No covenants. No association. No anything. That's when it all clicked. There was no HOA. There never had been. Diane and Marcus weren't enforcing rules. They were inventing them. They weren't protecting property values. They were collecting money. And they were doing it by exploiting fear, paperwork, and the fact that most people don't know how HOAs are actually formed. What hit me hardest wasn't the scam itself. It was how effective it had been. How quickly a calm, connected neighborhood had turned quiet and tense. How many people had paid just to avoid confrontation. That's when I realized this wasn't something I could ignore. Because once fear takes root in a neighborhood, it doesn't stop at money. It erodes trust. It isolates people. It makes everyone retreat behind their doors and stop talking. And the only way to break that was to talk. All right, let's slow this down for a second, because this is where the story stops being just drama and starts becoming a lesson. Think of this as me pulling you aside and saying, okay, here's how this actually works, and here's why so many people got trapped. According to standard regulations, a real homeowners association cannot just be declared by a couple of motivated neighbors. An HOA is created through a very specific legal process. There are recorded covenants tied to the property deeds, bylaws filed with the county, disclosures provided to homeowners, and this part is critical, approval by the homeowners themselves, usually through a formal vote. No vote, no findings, no HOA. It's that simple. So how did Diane and Marcus get away with it? Even temporarily? This is where psychology does most of the heavy lifting. This is the psychological trap that people like them rely on, perceived authority. Humans are wired to respond to structure. When something looks official, formatted documents, section numbers, stern language, we instinctively assume legitimacy. Most people don't want to be the first one to say, hey, is this fake? Because that feels risky. What if it is real and you're the only one pushing back? Add fear to that equation, and logic takes a back seat. Words like collections, liens, and legal action are powerful because they're vague but catastrophic. Most homeowners don't know exactly how those processes work, but they know they don't want to find out the hard way. So instead of verifying, they comply. Paying feels safer than questioning. That's not stupidity. That's survival instinct. From a legal perspective, what Diane and Marcus were doing wasn't a gray area. Pretending to represent a legal entity that doesn't exist and collecting money under that pretense is fraud. Threatening escalating consequences to pressure payment crosses into theft by deception, and depending on how it's worded, even extortion. Real HOAs don't operate in shadows. They are painfully transparent, documented, and regulated, sometimes to the point of frustration. And here's a key detail most people miss. Legitimate HOAs hate improvisation. Everything is slow, formal, and recorded. If someone is inventing rules on the fly, delivering fines by hand, or getting angry when asked basic questions, that's not authority. That's exposure. Now, let's talk motivation. This wasn't just about money. Money was a benefit, sure, but control was the goal. Diane and Marcus moved into a neighborhood without centralized authority and saw a vacuum. Instead of adapting, they tried to fill that vacuum themselves. Control over rules becomes control over people. And once a few neighbors complied, that compliance reinforced their sense of power. That's also why they reacted so aggressively when questioned. Scams don't fear silence. They fear verification. The moment someone starts checking registries, calling city offices, or asking when and how, the illusion starts cracking fast. And at this point in the story, the illusion was already breaking. Because once people stop being afraid, they start talking. Once you realize the authority in front of you isn't real, something strange happens inside your chest. The fear that's been sitting there quietly starts to dissolve, and in its place comes clarity, then anger, then resolve. That's exactly what happened to me after I confirmed there was no HOA, no registration, no legal standing of any kind. So I started doing the one thing fake authority cannot survive. I talked, not publicly at first, not dramatically, just neighbor to neighbor, at mailboxes, over fences, while taking out trash or pretending to admire someone's lawn. I asked the same question every time, calmly and casually. Hey, did you ever vote for an HOA? The answer was always no. Some people laughed nervously. Some looked confused. Others looked relieved, like they'd been holding on to doubt, but didn't know if they were allowed to trust it. When I told them what I'd found, no filings, no city record, no state registration, you could almost see their posture change. Fear has a physical shape, and so does relief. Within days, the neighborhood felt different. People stopped whispering Diane and Marcus's names. Someone created a group chat. Another neighbor printed out copies of the county search results showing no HOA existed. Conversations that had been happening behind closed doors moved on to sidewalks and front yards. For the first time in weeks, people were comparing notes instead of avoiding each other. Diane noticed immediately. She confronted me in the small park at the end of the street one afternoon, her voice sharp, her expression tight with anger she wasn't bothering to hide anymore. There were neighbors around, kids playing, dogs barking. It wasn't private, and she hated that. "You're tearing this neighborhood apart," she snapped. I remember answering calmly, almost gently. "We had a neighborhood before you arrived. You just didn't like that you weren't in charge of it." That's when Marcus stepped in. He started talking about long-term plans, maintaining standards, and protecting property values. He said people should be grateful someone was finally willing to step up and lead. That's when one of my neighbors, quiet guy, rarely speaks, asked a question that landed like a hammer. "Then where did the money go?" Silence. Not dramatic silence. Awkward silence. The kind where everyone realizes the same thing at the same time. No improvements. No repairs. No shared expenses. No accounting. Just checks written directly to Diane and Marcus. Diane laughed. Loudly. Too loudly. She said we were being dramatic, that we didn't understand how these things worked, and that we were making a huge mistake. She warned us we'd regret this, that there would be consequences. But the threat didn't land. Because fear only works when people feel alone. That evening, a few of us made calls. Not emotional calls. Not angry ones. Just factual. Fake association. Collected money. Threats of legal action. Documents provided. No legal record found. The police listened carefully. They asked questions. They took notes. They took it seriously. The investigation moved fast. Within days, squad cars were parked on our street in broad daylight. Officers knocked on Diane and Marcus's door while neighbors watched from porches and windows, not out of spite, but out of disbelief that it had gotten this far. Diane argued. Marcus tried to explain. Neither explanation held up. They were taken in for fraud and theft by deception. No dramatic scene. No shouting. Just the quiet humiliation of realizing the performance was over. They were released on bail later that day, but the damage was done. Their authority evaporated instantly. People stopped answering their messages. Fines were ignored. Notices went straight into the trash. The legal process dragged on for months. Some neighbors received partial restitution. Most didn't. The money had already been spent or moved, and that part still hurts to think about. Not because of the dollars, but because trust is harder to rebuild than savings. Eventually, Diane and Marcus sold their house and left. No would-be, no apology, just gone. And something else happened once they were. The neighborhood exhaled. Potlucks came back. Someone organized a paint night. Someone else fired up a grill and invited everyone over like nothing bad had ever happened. Kids started playing freely again. People stopped glancing over their shoulders when they pulled into their driveways. We didn't replace the fake HOA with a real one. We didn't overcorrect. We just went back to being neighbors who talked to each other. Every now and then, someone would joke, "Is this fence color allowed?" And we'd all laugh because now we understood how fragile fake power really is. The experience changed us, though, in a good way. We learned that community isn't about rules or enforcement. It's about connection, about speaking up early, about not letting fear convince you that silence is safer than questions. And Diane and Marcus? They lost more than money or reputation. They lost the illusion that control can exist without consent. So here's the part of this story that stayed with me long after Diane and Marcus were gone. Long after the police reports and court dates faded into memory. It wasn't the fake fines or the paperwork, and it definitely wasn't the embarrassment of watching them get escorted out of their own house. It was how quiet everything had become while it was happening. That silence didn't mean people agreed with what was going on. It meant they were scared. Scared of being wrong. Scared of making things worse. Scared of becoming a target. And fear has a way of shrinking people's worlds until the safest option feels like doing nothing. The lesson here is that most abuses of power don't start with force. They start with confidence. Someone shows up sounding official, holding documents that look legitimate enough, and speaking with certainty, and suddenly everyone assumes the hard questions have already been asked by someone else. That assumption is where the damage begins. And that instinct isn't weakness. It's human. This is the psychological trap that fake authority relies on. When consequences are framed as vague but catastrophic, liens, collections, lawsuits, your brain shifts out of logic and into self-preservation. In that state, compliance feels safer than curiosity. Paying feels easier than verifying. Silence feels safer than speaking up. That's how Diane and Marcus got traction. Not because they were smart, but because they understood fear. From a legal perspective, this story is a reminder that legitimate authority is never afraid of questions. Real HOAs, real institutions, real governance. They are slow, boring, and documented. They can explain who voted, where rules are recorded, and how money is handled without raising their voice. The moment someone reacts with anger, urgency, or threats when you ask basic questions, that's not strength. That's exposure. One of the hardest things to watch after everything came out was how many neighbors blamed themselves. I should have known better. I feel stupid. I should have pushed back. But the truth is, the responsibility never belonged to them. It belonged to the people who lied, manipulated, and exploited trust for control and profit. Scams like this don't thrive because people are foolish. They thrive because people are isolated. The turning point in our neighborhood wasn't the police showing up. It was the moment people started talking to each other, comparing letters, sharing information, realizing they weren't alone. Fake power cannot survive shared knowledge. And that's the real power of a community. Not enforcement, not rules, not authority titles. Connection. If you live in an HOA, near one, or someone has ever handed you notice that made your stomach drop, pause before reacting. Ask questions. Talk to your neighbors. Look things up. You're not being difficult. You're being responsible. Because the truth is, the most dangerous sentence in situations like this is, "I'm sure someone else already checked." So don't assume. Verify. And I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with an HOA that crossed the line? Have you seen someone fake authority just to control others? Or were you the one who finally spoke up first? Share your experiences in the comments. These conversations matter more than most people realize, because the fastest way to lose a neighborhood is to stop talking to the people who live in it.